All right, welcome to the Jonathan Benaya podcast. Now, as I flipped through this BBC Wildlife magazine on my desk this morning, I saw that trophy hunting, or call it sport hunting, is defined as the shooting of carefully selected animals. It's frequently, people mainly come to, they really are interested in those big wildlife species like the rhinos, elephants, zebras, giraffes, and lions, but even several other species. It's usually an activity that is done under very strict official government licensing. Often, you have people going back home with trophies, which the trophy in this case is usually the head or the skin or any other body part of an animal. And oftentimes, the hunter will take this home as a souvenir. It is a booming industry and it is legal. And you must hear that it is a legal activity. Although there are still some restrictions on species that can be hunted, there are also some restrictions on where the hunting can happen, but also when the hunting can take place. There seem to also be some restrictions on the type of weapons that are being used in this sport. Hunting is indeed legal in many countries, and nearly a quarter of those are on the African continent. The last time I checked, the African countries on this list that now permit hunting include Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Congo, you have Ethiopia, you have Liberia, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana, the Republic of South Africa, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and my own country, Uganda. But judging by how successful many of these destinations that I just mentioned have come in light of conservation, it seems to paint a picture that hunting might actually be a useful form of conservation, especially with the large sums of money that are charged for a license to come and shoot a wild animal on the African continent. Now, those in support of hunting have their argument on why why hunting is a conservation model that can have successes. But in the hardcore conservation world, this is many a time a highly controversial topic. And those opposed to it often table very solid and passionate positions on why a future without hunting would be a brighter future for the planet's most iconic wildlife species. And of course, there are ecosystems as well. But the big question is hunting really conservation? On the podcast today, I have a professional hunter with experience in writing about this sport, but also he's covered this topic quite extensively in leading magazines across the globe. And then my second guest on the podcast today, we do have the Africa wildlife specialist at the Humane Society International. And we do also expect to have a representative from the Uganda Wildlife Authority to kind of give us a local perspective on what exactly takes place in this activity. We were meant to also have the executive president of the Born Free Foundation, that's Mr. Will Travers, but it seems something did come up, so we'll have to proceed without him. And of course, leading up today, I did reach out to quite a number of agencies, one being the Professional Hunters Association of South Africa, and also the Safari Club International, which I believe is the biggest, or call it the largest community of hunters on the planet. They seem to be quite busy lobbying against a recent proposal by United States Fish and Wildlife Service, which intends to increase restrictions on the importation of sport-hunted elephants. But in their absence, I am very, 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 very privileged to have the experts on the podcast today with me. And we will just jointly have a respectful discussion on this fascinating topic. So it should be both an educative and also a very interesting episode for you guys listening. So yes, thank you so much for tuning in. We will have this and more after the short break.
What's up, my beautiful people? Welcome to the Jonathan Benaya podcast, a show that is wild, very wild. We are proudly Uganda's #1 conservation and tourism show, but we also benefit from a listenership from all across the African continent and the world at large. We try to put out a new episode every Sunday with discussions ranging around how to make the natural world a better place, creating awesome images, telling stories with words, wildlife films and photography, with occasional musings on sound and tech. If these topics fascinate you as much as they interest me, I promise you this podcast will have you in a spin. I do share a lot of my personal experiences, and from time to time, I'll have 1 or 2 guests on the podcast to have some very insightful discussions. So thank you so much for tuning in, and enjoy your time here.
All right, guys, welcome back to the Jonathan Benaya podcast, where we talk about the earth. We do talk about images. We talk about words, wildlife films and photography, tourism and travel, and occasionally music. As I did mention before the break, on the podcast today, we explore this fascinating question of whether hunting is indeed conservation. But before we dive right in, let's just quickly get to meet the guests. Joining the discussion all the way from Sweden is Jens Ulrik. Jens is a seasoned hunting advocate and a hunter himself. He does have experience in leading and participating in hunting trips. He's been involved in publishing hunting magazines since 1992, both as a publisher, an editor, and also as a freelance writer and photographer. His writing does specialize around guns and equipment, but he also does historical articles and hunting reports as well. For the last few years, Jens has focused specifically on communicating the position of hunting to non-hunters through mass media in Denmark, as well as several other international outlets. He joins the podcast on behalf of the hunting community to help us understand how and why they do what they do. So yes, welcome to the podcast, Jens.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction. I've been a hunter here in Scandinavia for as long as it has been legal for me. We can only start hunting when we are 16 years of age. We have to go through an education and get our hunting license here. And basically, Scandinavia is one of the areas in Europe with the highest density of hunters, because we have our own big game here. Here in Sweden, we have moose, we have wild boar, we have all kinds of deer that we have always managed with hunting as a tool for wildlife management. And also the entire population here appreciate this sustainable output of wild meat that we get from the hunt. So we are definitely hunters here in Scandinavia, and since we basically all do it because we like to do it. I know that we are obviously fully aware that everybody can buy their meat in the supermarket, but we like to be in the nature, managing our wildlife this way. We find it exciting to hunt. We find it's a challenge. So we grow up with this, and we simply like to hunt. And it's like this in many parts of the world. And what happens is that when we're talking about hunting tourism, which is a much more precise term than trophy hunting, because trophy hunting is either all hunters are trophy hunters or almost no hunters are trophy hunters. Here in Sweden, if I hunt for 40 years and once in those 40 years I shoot a big moose, I will keep the horns on my wall as a memento of that day. But all the small moose I shoot on the wall, on the way there, will just be part of management. So am I a trophy hunter for keeping this one set of horns, or am I not? I think this whole trophy hunting definition and discussion is a little bit silly, but we can definitely talk about hunting tourism, because yes, we like to hunt, and we like to hunt in new places, just as golfers like to travel the world to test new golf courses, or divers like to travel the world to see new fish in the water. It's basically simple tourism to me, because we're doing what we're always doing. We like to hunt. We like to participate in that local wildlife management. And that's our motive for going to Africa.
Okay, I hear you. And you call it simple tourism. I'll come back to you in a bit. You've really painted for us a picture that is from the Scandinavian side of the world. But I'm quite certain as well you've had some expeditions on the African continent. So I'll come back to you again just to help us also understand the difference between what you call, is it hunting tourism, and what we know quite popularly as sport hunting, trophy hunting, the hunting business. And I know my second guest, who I will introduce in a bit, will also have some comments reacting to what you just shared. All right, now guys, I'm also privileged to have Dr. Matthew Schurch. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Dr. Matthew is the African wildlife specialist at the Humane Society International, HSI. Now, HSI is an organization that stands up for animal protection in countries across the African continent, but also in other parts of the world. They do run active campaigns to improve conditions for both farmed animals, but also protect wildlife as well. HSI addresses issues such as what they call the inhumane practices and conditions that animals have to go through. Talk of things like illegal wildlife trade, talk about animal welfare, talk about threats to endangered species, things like the slaughter of marine mammals, things like the use of mammals, or rather animals, in research and testing, and several other sticky issues in which animals seem to be suffering. Dr. Matthew joins us from South Africa, where I believe they are an hour behind us here in East Africa, and he will be helping us paint a picture of what the anti-hunting community, where they come from. So welcome to the podcast, Matthew.
Thank you very much for having me, Jonathan. I've travelled around the African continent since about 2005, and I've been fortunate enough to visit Uganda on a number of occasions. I'm passionate about wildlife. I love the nature and the outdoors, and I've been quite involved in leopard conservation since about 2010. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion today.
Fantastic. Now, we still don't have the representative from UWA yet. I did want to get a picture of the picture on ground here. Of course, I did mention in the intro that we do have hunting that is permitted as a wildlife use right here in Uganda. And I just wanted to get a picture from the Uganda Wildlife Authority regarding what exactly goes into this activity. What is the safari like? Are they also do they also jump onto safari tracks like the contemporary tourist would? Are there specific animals that are hunted? But I think we'll have to bring them on in the future. But in the absence of Uganda Wildlife Authority, let me just hear from Jens. Of course, you did, as in your opening remarks, you did mention that these terms are quite confusing, or rather confused by the general public. And by general public, I speak for so many people tuned in today. So help us just understand the difference, but also help us respond to the question of people who say that trophy hunting is a completely unnecessary activity, and it's adding to this threat to wildlife conservation that is already a major global issue.
First of all, luckily, what you call trophy hunting, what I call hunting tourism, same, is, as you said in your introduction, heavily regulated by scientists, not only locally in Africa, but all over the world. There's regulations on trade with animal parts, including hunting trophies. So, and the receiving end of things are also regulating. So I cannot just go somewhere and shoot something without a permit from the local authorities, without a permit from the international community to transport this, and without a permit from my local government to import it into my country. So there's a lot of scientists, a lot of zoologists and biologists supervising this all the time, making sure that everything is sustainable. And, we have this big conservation organization in this world called the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's the biggest nature conservation organization there is. And one of their jobs is to constantly evaluate the conservation status of all the species that could be threatened by human activity around the world. And due to, according to the IUCN, what you call trophy hunting is not a major threat to a single species on our planet. And I would claim, and I would actually claim it in a way that I would say there's evidence to suggest that never in history has trophy hunting led to the extinction of a single species. So this is myth. Trophy hunting as it's done today, or hunting tourism as it's done today, is extremely heavily regulated, just as hunting is heavily regulated here in our home countries. Here in Sweden, we hunt about 80,000 moose every year. We hunt about 200,000 wild boar. We hunt about 100,000 roe deer. It's big numbers, but everything is regulated just as it is in Africa. Another thing that I think is very relevant to point out, especially to an African audience, is that you guys can be very, very proud of yourself, because a few years ago, there was a team of scientists who evaluated country by country how good each nation were at protecting their megafauna. Megafauna is big animals above 20 kilos, as an indicator of their general nature conservation efforts, you could say. And in the top 3 worldwide was Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. All 3 of those countries use hunting tourism as one of many tools in their nature and wildlife management. It's not a coincidence that these 3 countries are in the top 3. So they have been doing hunting tourism for decades, and yet they are world champions of large mammal nature conservation. So how can that be? We have another example with your neighboring country, Kenya. It's a sad example, actually, because Kenya used to be the hunting destination in Africa. It was the country that every hunter wanted to visit. It was the classical hunting country. Hemingway and Hunter and our own Karen Blixen from Denmark all hunted in what was then known as British East Africa, Kenya. But due to political pressure from anti-hunting organizations in the 70s, Kenya shut down big game hunting very abruptly in 76 or 77. And since then, Kenya has lost 70 to 80% of all large wild animals in that country without any hunting tourism. Hunting tourism is not allowed, and still they are 80% down. In the same time span, the southern African nations that actually more or less at the same time tried to develop the hunting tourism industry, in those countries, animals population have boomed. And it goes not only for the normal species like impalas and springboks, which is a normal antelope in southern Africa, it also goes for rare species like white rhino, black rhino. These populations are the strongest in the countries where they're actually managed with hunting tourism. Another little fact is that in all of Africa, if you look at the areas protected by different forms of tourism, hunting tourism is funding the protection of habitat around 2 times as much as all the national parks combined. So it's a very, very big source of funding, and it's so far been extremely successful. And one thing is very important, because many people think that we as hunters are taking credit for this. And we really shouldn't, because hunters in this system are only the paying customers. We are not doing the nature conservation on the ground. We come with the money that makes the nature conservation possible. So it's the land users, whether it's nations or communities or private landowners, depending on the country and their land use system. they are the heroes in this. And when they choose hunting over regular farming, it's because it pays off. It's a better business for them to do hunting with natural animals than to clear the areas and use the same area for goats and cattle. So it's always a question of what is the best business. So if hunting in the future is fully or partly banned, and the hunting industry has to turn down a little bit, we will lose hunting areas that are now natural habitat to traditional farming, because it will no longer pay off to have those buffaloes and giraffes and zebras and elephants and all the antelopes. And instead, these areas will be cleared, and the locals will use the areas for more profitable business, producing beef or sheep or goat or whatever. So this is so the hunters are not really the heroes. The hunters are the necessary paying customers here.
Okay, now that's some very interesting insights from Jens. And I did hear you did touch on IUCN, and you did also talk about what you say some species that are recovering, what you would attach to their decisions, the country's decisions to promote hunting. And I'd like to get a bit of a discussion going, especially on so many of those topics that you've really touched on that I know can kind of have, if I could call them, they can be debatable, especially with some of the facts. And I'd like to bring in Dr. Matthew. Now, Dr. Matthew, there's an analysis on that CITES did, and they reveal that 4 of the threatened taxa, or call them animals, from the African Big 5 species. Those are the African elephant, African leopard, and the African lion. These are among the top most traded and delicate taxa, and we know their populations are really at risk. Of those top 20, the African lion has been said to be the most strongest. The creme de la creme of the hunters that come to the continent seem to be wanting to have that experience of taking down a lion. Matthew, just listening to Jen's submission and also just the work that you do as HSI, I'd like to know what your position as HSI is in light of this activity that Jens is calling hunting tourism, but also let us know what HSI is, what are you doing in your campaign against hunting, call it trophy hunting.
Thank you, Jonathan. So HSI is we're primarily concerned with the welfare, well-being and conservation of all animals, whether these are companion animals that you might have at home on your properties, or whether or not this is the largest animals and mammals roaming the African plains. By definition, trophy hunting really is the killing of animals for the purpose of acquiring specific parts of these animals. We're talking tusks, antlers, horns, skins, and these items are typically displayed, often for competition, for bragging rights. Trophy hunters really do not kill animals in order to eat them. It's not a means of subsistence for them. For these reasons, this is why HSI doesn't support trophy hunting, and why we're trying to actively work to raise public awareness to end this kind of corporate support of trophy hunters. And we're trying to impose legal regulations and better regulations to protect these animals. So we're campaigning extensively, a lot in South Africa and a lot in the US, to improve these restrictions. Trophy hunting really does threaten the survival of many species, and it threatens the vital roles that these animals play in a delicate functioning of the ecosystem. Trophy hunting removes critical components of the ecosystem, which result in long and short-term harm to the survival of these species, and for all of the species actually that depend upon those ecosystems. For example, the IUCN Red List assessment for the leopard states, if poorly managed, trophy hunting can be detrimental to the population, especially when permits are focused in one geographical area and targeted individuals are in their prime. Leopard populations have declined by 30% over the last decade. And to give this a little bit of local context, in 2016, I visited Lake Maburu in Uganda, and I spent many nights there trying to see leopard specifically, but I failed. I was told by the local guides and rangers there that leopards are incredibly rare to see. Yet recently I was reading a paper published in 2020, and I was shocked to read that in that paper, between 2001 and 2016, a total of 6 leopards were trophy hunted around one of Uganda's premier national parks. HSI, we really want to protect these animals and maintain the ecosystems that they're a part of. Additionally, there are many ways that trophy hunting can negatively affect population dynamics and spatial distribution of species. Aspects like low reproductive output, reduced offspring survival, lower adult male to female survival, and altered age structures. All of these kind of alterations to the population dynamics are seen in species such as lions, leopards, cougars, and elephants. And those are the species that are really trophy hunted in Africa.
Okay, Dr. Matthew, it's very clear that the HSI position is hunting is more of a disastrous or has more disastrous effects than it has benefits for the long-term conservation of African wildlife. And I'd like to just go back to Jens a little bit and really ask, if I could call it a personal question. And maybe I'm just taking a peek into the life, or call it the heart of a hunter. When you shoot these animals, would you say you love them?
Absolutely. I have always loved everything about nature, not only wildlife, but the entire way it works. I spend most of my time in nature, and in my spare time, when I'm not hunting, I'm fishing, or I'm making drawings, or I'm taking pictures, or I'm writing about nature. My life is nature, and most of the hunters I know are very, very deeply submerged into nature. We are out there locally here a long time before the sun comes up, in the winter and in the fall, and we're seeing the nature wakes up, and it's really a very, very huge experience where the hunting part is just a corner of it. But it's an important corner. We are hunters, and we like to hunt, and we are not ashamed of harvesting from that natural surplus that is generated. Just as the tree grows, population that thrives grows. And it's exactly the same, biologically speaking, in Europe as it is in Africa. If we harvest less than the annual surplus, then the population will be stable or growing, and it's fully sustainable. It's the oldest way for mankind to get meat on the table, and if managed right, it's as I said, fully sustainable. I would like to just make a quick comment about hunting that's not managed right, because of course hunting can be catastrophic if it's not done right, if it's not regulated right. If hunters are allowed to shoot too many of a species in one area or what have you, of course things can go wrong. But that's not what we are talking about. When we're talking about Africa, we're talking about 1.2 million square kilometers of hunting area being protected as natural habitat because of the income from hunting. And the net result is that the animals, both in short term and in long term, thrives a lot better on the hunting areas than outside the hunting areas. And that is what we all need to come down to. Because obviously we can find some really bad examples of things going wrong. There's a lot of hunters out there, and not all of them are nice people. I'm not saying that. It's not a universal solution, but in total, the net result is extremely possible. And we can prove that.
All right, Jens. You did touch on regulation, and I'll come back to that in just later on in the podcast. But I'd like to go back to the question that I asked around whether you love these animals or whether there's any feeling of remorse as you shoot them. Many anti-hunters find it very hard when someone who hunts animals says they love them. And I guess majority of the public, including myself and those that are tuned in, might come or rather approach this from a point of just seeing the animals that we've grown up seeing on documentaries on BBC Earth and National Geographic, and then someone comes and shoots them. Do you, in your heart of hearts, see where the general public, aside from like the experts like Dr. Matthew in HSI who have really done all the research, do you see where the general public really is coming from with all these, if I could call them, quite negative comments that I see on social media when a photo is shared?
Absolutely. Today I have had a death threat, a very graphic one on Twitter actually. So of course I see non-hunters being shocked by the idea that somebody like me, like all hunters, like all fishermen, enjoys an activity that includes killing of animals. I can understand that, and I think the issue here is that modern people has been very much removed from nature. Here in Sweden, every year we have one of two cases of people on public television being surprised that meat didn't grow in the supermarket. I mean, we are down to this level. When you're saying it's difficult to understand how a hunter can love wildlife, I could just respond very easily saying it's difficult to understand why every meat eater in the world doesn't hate cows or hate chicken, because you don't eat meat because you hate cows or you hate chickens. You eat meat because you like to eat meat, and you are willing to pay the price, even in the consequences for the animals, to have that piece of meat on your plate, right?
Jens, I hope you aren't comparing oranges and apples here.
No, I'm not really, because how is it different to buy a steak in a supermarket and for me to go into the forest and kill the wild boar myself? When I kill the wild boar myself, I know this particular wild boar had a natural life in the forest as it's supposed to. I know exactly how it died. I took responsibility to make sure that it had a swift and painless as possible death. I know everything about this piece of wild boar that I then put on my plate and serve for my family and my children and their friends and my friends. You know nothing about the steak that you buy in the supermarket. That might have been a poor cow that was beaten all his life, lived in a dirty stable, and had a terrible experience being slaughtered in an abattoir. You know nothing about that. But that cow died because people are buying the steaks. If nobody were buying the steaks, no cows would have to die, right? So a dead animal is a dead animal. The only difference is that I, as a hunter, take fully responsibility for this particular piece of meat on my plate. And that brings me back to the question of remorse. No, I don't really feel remorse, because when I go hunting, I have already decided that I'm going to try today to harvest, kill, if you want, a wild boar or an ostrich or whatever that animal is. So the decision is already taken. And in the moment, I really just want to be efficient, because one thing that no hunters want is to see the animals suffer unnecessarily. This is not some kind of sadism or something like that. We have decided we're going to try and kill this or this animal, and then we're doing whatever we can to do it swiftly and cleanly. So I don't think a lot of hunters feel remorse, to be honest. It's a process that was thought through way before we even went into the bush or into the forest.
Okay, well, just listening to you saying that hunters don't feel remorse, it's quite interesting. And I know, at least from listening to conversations or rather discussions with other hunters, some of them say that they actually do feel remorse and they go down and prey on the animal that they've shot. But let me just bring in Dr. Matthew, especially since you did also talk about steak and call it the domestic animals and trying to compare them to these what we call iconic species that we have on the continent. I know Dr. Matthew back at HSI, as I did mention, the large section of the work they do is that they are advocating for welfare of all animals on the planet. But let me also just take more of a neutral position as well as I ask this question to HSI and Dr. Matthew. Dr. Matthew, some liberalists say that we are losing more wildlife from other threats at even a faster rate than what we are calling hunting safaris. One of the biggest threats is the lack of enough land for large populations of people. Large populations are eating up a lot of habitats, especially on the African continent. But then you also have these populations of wildlife also multiplying, and they need land to exist. So you're talking about things to do with carrying capacity. But also you have another challenge, which is the case of communities in a continuous battle with wildlife. Wildlife getting onto the farms of communities, wildlife attacking, family members, relatives, and there seems to be human-wildlife conflict all across the continent. And if you did ask the Uganda Wildlife Authority, that is actually one of their biggest challenges to conservation. But you also have, in some other parts of the world, where you have animals just dying of natural causes. And you're losing all those animals for free. There is no money that is coming in. Yet you've got someone who is saying, someone like Jens, who is saying, okay, let me just use the example of $750,000 in exchange for just shooting a few animals. And they say you can use this money in your anti-poaching campaigns, in your patrols. What would you be your response to a discussion like that, where people say, can't we sacrifice a few in exchange of conserving the bigger herd?
Thanks. So I think one of the things we need to understand, and you're right, ecosystems, these wildlife ecosystems, they need balance, but they also need flux. They need a change of individual animals, and that happens through natural routes like dispersals and natural deaths. Okay, whether that's through predation or dying because of a lack of some water in the area, these deaths are natural. However, we're living in a world with a growing human population, and that's constantly consuming more and more physical space and demanding more resources. This is reducing the available natural habitat for these wild species. However, this doesn't mean that we should resort to a bullet to control these kind of problems. Wildlife shouldn't be seen as a panacea for these social economic issues. It's not a quick fix. These are short-term solutions that the trophy hunting industry is bringing. Killing and selling animals supports and encourages a trade industry around these animals, an illegal wildlife trade industry that builds up around these industries. And this further exacerbates the problem. What we need is smart, innovative conservation management, that can bring these patchwork of ecosystems together for the wild species. So when you talk about the financial contributions of trophy hunting, it is often touted as a way of providing funds for conservation due to the large sums of money that it generates at face value. However, a recent report by Good Governance Africa has pointed out that this claim is based on extremely little evidence, and that published literature has raised concerns over trophy hunting's efficacy, but also its likely harms. It's just simply not the conservation tool that it's purported to be. This report also highlights that trophy hunting industry as a whole and as an economic generator is dwarfed by the tourism sector, and so any conservation needs could easily be met through expanded non-consumptive tourism. When we look at the reports from the World Travel and Tourism Council in 2018, they found that $194 billion was generated in Africa through tourism. That's 8.5% of Africa's GDP, and that sustained 24 million jobs. However, when you look at the trophy hunting industry, in 8 sub-Saharan African countries, that only brought in $132 million. That's only, I think it's less than 1% of the overall tourism spending in these studied countries, and that provided at most 15,000 jobs. So the trophy hunting industry it's not comparable to the tourism industry, and all of the conservation needs financially can be met by expanding that non-consumptive tourism market.
Okay, yeah, those are interesting comments, and I know Jens might be burning with quite a response to that question, but you do indeed point to a very interesting statistic. You know, quite a number of trophy, or rather hunters, I know Jens doesn't really want me to use the word trophy that much, but it's pretty much a synonym out there that we can't hide from. But quite a number of hunters are quick to claim that the activities that they do help the animals, but they also help these poor indigenous communities in Africa and elsewhere. And Dr. Matthew in his submission has really touched on something that I guess reminds me of a comment that Jens made earlier when he was referring to was it the ban on conservation, or rather the ban on hunting in Kenya in the 1970s. But you see, Kenya's tourism has grown in insurmountable sums, and that comes with benefits to the communities, that comes with so many positive impacts along this cross-cutting value chain of the tourism sector on the African continent, and the benefits are immense. But then you have your hunting industry, which many a time on the African continent, all these outfitters are owned by foreign people from the Americas, people from Europe, and there's this argument that it's causing quite a bit of income inequalities in the communities. Although you say that your efforts are supporting the community, many of these companies are actually having hunting guides who are from other parts of the world. They're not using local guides. So why does your argument oftentimes around community support kind of feel flawed, and what would be your response to that, and also some of the comments that Dr. Matthew was making earlier on?
I guess that was a question to me. First of all, I would say that what the local communities get out of any kind of tourism is really different from country to country. When we talk about hunting, we have some very bad examples where local communities has been more or less cheated and almost got nothing. And we have some very good examples from, amongst others, Namibia, where local communities actually run the entire hunting operation and they get 100% of the turnover. Of course, as a traveling hunter coming to visit Africa, and as a person who would like to see this continue, I would like to see more money go into local communities as much as possible. I love the Namibian model. In South Africa, you have a lot of private landowners, and obviously a lot of that money goes into running their farms. Regardless of their color, whatever it is, they're also a local community, and a hunting farm in South Africa employs 2 to 3 times as many people as a similar farm doing regular cattle and sheep. So it's very, very different from country to country, but we in the hunting community would like to see as much as possible go to the local communities, because it's key to local acceptance of wildlife that they actually have as many benefits as they can have. But that's basically the point. And regarding Dr. Matthews' statistics, obviously, I would say they are skewed in the wrong direction. There's more than 50,000 jobs in South Africa, in one country alone, connected to hunting tourism. But he is, on the other hand, very right that hunting tourism has a much smaller turnover than regular ecotourism photo safaris. But then we have to ask ourselves, why is it that through 5 decades now, hunting tourism is the choice for land users on more than twice the amount of land compared to photo safari? And if it is so easy to just swish as Dr. Matthew implies, why haven't they done it during these last 5 decades? We always hear about all their alternative solutions, but we never see them implemented anywhere. When hunting concessions are abandoned, which happened just recently in Tanzania because the US brought in some hunting trophy import bans a couple of years ago on elephant and lion, made it less financially viable to run a hunting concession. The hunting concessions were abandoned, and everybody was saying, fine, now the photographic tourism operations are coming in and taking over and showing us how easy it is. No photographic tourism organizations came in. So these lands were abandoned. The locals came in. They had no longer any choice. They had to start farming. So they brought in their cattle and their goats. And the first thing that disappeared was all the wildlife, because they're in the way of regular farming. That's exactly what happened in Kenya as well. So you have a booming tourism industry in Kenya. It all goes to a few very small national parks, but outside the national parks, where you used to have the hunting concessions, there's no wild animals left. They're all gone. They have been poached out of existence, and the local farmers have moved in their cattle and their sheep because it no longer pays off to have the wild animals there.
Yes, let me just cut you there and bring in Dr. Matthew. I know it might be good to offer him the opportunity as well to just respond to some of the comments you've had. But also, you do bring up an interesting topic around the impact that, call it the photo safaris or ecotourism, has vis-a-vis the little turnover that the hunting community has. And then it also tickles me in the side of the effects that you have, the actual, call it geographical impact that hunting has on the continent vis-a-vis the tourists, or call it the photo safari. And I'd like to ask Dr. Matthew, as you respond to some of the comments that Jens has just brought up, when you compare the impact, call it the geographical footprint of the hunting safaris on the continent vis-a-vis ecotourism, don't you feel like ecotourism might actually pose some very significant threats to conservation, especially when you have in some destinations that I cannot mention for the purpose of not being cancelled, you have a mass tourism form of tourism that is coming into some of these destinations and really impacting on the species there. Do you feel like ecotourism is in a better position than the guys hunting?
Yes. So this argument comparing the pros and cons of consumptive versus non-consumptive land uses, the trophy hunting versus tourism kind of argument that is put out there. This really is just a red herring argument here. And, wildlife-based photographic tourism really makes meaningful contributions to the socio-economic well-being of societies at large. It embraces the adage that if it stays, it will pay. And this is a concept that is opposed to the archaic principle that's often kind of touted in countries like South Africa of if it pays, it stays. And that's just not true. If you take the case of, say, Uganda, Uganda brought in trophy hunting after it had been banned for many years. And they brought that in as a way to try and improve the socio-economic kind of income for communities around certain areas. What they found after many years of studying the data in this area is that many of those communities around these national parks were actually very dissatisfied with the trophy hunting industry. They weren't reaping the benefits that they were told they would. Poaching rates around these areas, even with the trophy hunting that was taking place, were on the increase towards the later periods of this study. So trophy hunting doesn't have these socio-economic improvements to the communities that is purported to. However, the trophy hunting, the photographic industry really does. It employs far more jobs. It brings in far more wealth. If we look at a case, for instance, in South Africa or in Kenya. In South Africa, the trophy hunting industry contributes $341 million to the South African economy, and it really only employs 17,000 people. However, you compare that to the trophy hunting, the photographic ecotourism industry in South Africa, that brings in $32 billion here and employs 1.5 million people in that industry. So people are benefiting by having the photographic ecotourism experiences, and that's creating jobs, and that's bringing in wealth to the country, which is benefiting those communities.
Interesting. Now I need to put an end to this discussion. I know Jens probably wanted to come in, but in the interest of time, I just want to also jump onto something that Jens did bring up earlier in the discussion, and this was to do with regulation. I was just searching around the internet, and there doesn't seem to be a set regulatory body aside from like the associations. Mainstream conservation has bodies like IUCN, you have CITES, but in the hunters world, I don't know if there is a regulatory body. And this leads me to the question that I'm trying to ask. When you have situations like, if I could give that easy example of Cecil in Zimbabwe a couple of years ago, who was killed, and then 6 years later, his son, Zander, was also killed around, quite mockingly, around the same place in Zimbabwe. When you have a hunting business that says our business is regulated, we are hunting a specific style of animal, maybe old animals, weak animals, but then you have someone who is coming here and shooting a strong animal, one of the big animals. And while I was reading, I did realize that there is actually a record book that is maintained by the Safari Club International, which is kind of a way of thanking these people for shooting the biggest animals in the herd, and also the strongest animals in the herd. What is your response when things don't seem to go to plan, when people come and hunt against what you'd call the regulated parameters of especially specific species like the big cats?
First of all, the Cecil case, I really struggle to see the problem. Hwange National Park was the national park in Zimbabwe where Cecil the lion lived for his entire 13 years. 13 years for a lion is like 100 years for a human being. It's extremely unusual for a wild lion to become that old. So the Cecil case, to me, boils down to the fact that this was actually the right lion to shoot. He was ousted. He did not contribute to the future of lions anymore, and he was shot in the buffer zone around the national park. And this is important because...
How about the son, you say?
Yes, the son is shot 6 years later. How old was that son? It must have been at least 6 years. It was probably 10 or 11 years, also an old lion. I mean, Cecil had been dead 13 years old 6 years before, so his son must have been way more than 6 years old, and probably also the right lion to shoot. I don't know the particular case. But the point here is that these lions were shot in the buffer zone around the national park. Now in Zimbabwe, they have these buffer zones around the national parks to avoid setting up fences. Because when you have a buffer zone, you have a chance of keeping dangerous animals like lions and elephants within the park or the buffer zone and stopping them from wandering out into the agricultural land. Because it's really not practical to have old lions walking around freely among farms in agricultural land. They eat people, and the surrounding people do not like that. And if that happens, you will have poisonings of lions. You will have poaching of lions. You will create chaos, and that's why they have this buffer zone. So shooting a lion in the buffer zone is what Zimbabwean authorities decided on from the beginning when they designed that park and they designed the buffer zones around it. This was the purpose of the whole thing. And shooting these old male lions, well, obviously they would be the perfect lions to shoot. I have no idea how this so-called son of Cecil, what happened there or how old he was, but I can do the math and say he must have at least been 6, 7, or 8 years old, which is still an old wild lion. So, but this is one of the problems we have, is that we get these singular stories that is half fact and half prejudice and myth and ignorance all combined. And it creates a huge story on the internet and it goes viral and blah, blah, blah. Lions are no different than our brown bears here in Sweden or wolves here in Sweden. We manage the populations. In Zimbabwe, they manage the lion population. They have to. Otherwise, they get too many lions in society.
I guess why the news spreads that much is because you take those photos and you pause and you're happy.
I agree. And I agree that it's a very, very mixed and not a very good signal to send to the non-hunting world, that you have a beautiful dead animal and you have a guy with a rifle smiling behind it. It sends the wrong signals, especially because the people do not know what came before that. The people do not know that the killing of this problem elephant or the killing of these impalas or whatever was all part of a plan, and it was actually meant to be that way, one way or the other, and that the hunter may have prepared for this his whole life or her whole life, and they have worked very hard to achieve this, and when they achieve it, obviously it's like climbing a mountain or running a marathon or catching a big fish or getting a yes from the right girl that you ask to marry. You get happy from achieving things that you're planning to do, but I can perfectly well see how this provokes people who do not know the full story behind those pictures.
Interesting. Now, I want to bring in Dr. Matthew, but before I do, I know I do have a question for him regarding government legislation and regulation. But Jens, you did respond to the Cecil story as something that you don't really find to be an issue, and you've given your facts as to why you stand by that position. But I'd like to also ask you about two other topics that are quite controversial, even in the hunting community. These are canned hunting and bait hunting. Now, what I've read is that for people who come to shoot animals like the leopard, since it's quite a secretive or, if you could call it, elusive cat, they have to first shoot some antelopes, hang them on the trees, and kind of lure that leopard out. So you might have as many as 10 antelopes shot for the hunter to have an opportunity to shoot a leopard. So that's bait hunting. Now, canned hunting is, on the other hand, from my understanding, is where you have people coming and shooting animals that are either raised on private properties, but also in an enclosure where they do not have the freedom to run off. Do you also support those positions as strongly as you supported the Cecil story?
No, you will not find any large hunting associations around the world, including the comparatively small one that I work for, supporting canned hunting. Now I'm talking about canned hunting, and it is, as you say, canned hunting is when animals are raised under farm-like conditions and released in a pen and basically shot there. To us, it has nothing to do with hunting. We focus a lot on sustainability, on harvesting from a natural surplus. This is how we hunt back home. It's unthinkable to us to have a moose in a farm and then release it and shoot it. It has nothing to do with hunting for us. We respect the game animals, the wild animals, as wild, and we will not accept them being farmed in that way. So there's a very strong position around the world, basically, against what you can call canned hunting. Unfortunately, it's still an industry, especially with lions in South Africa, but everybody from the outside is working to put an end to that. Regarding bait, it's an entirely different matter, because baiting is a hunting method. When I shoot wild boar here in Sweden, they are nocturnal. And we need to shoot a couple of 100,000 of wild boar every year, because otherwise they destroy the farmers' crops. And the only efficient way to shoot wild boars is to bait them with corn. So we put corn on the ground to lure the wild boars out, and we shoot them at night. It's exactly the same as shooting a leopard, baiting it with meat. It's a hunting method, and in some cases that's what works, and in some cases other methods work. I don't really see a big problem in baiting as a hunting method. There's no more animal suffering going on, and it's a very selective method where you can make absolutely sure, in the case of the leopard, that you are shooting the right animal, because you will have time to see the animal and evaluate it and be sure that it's the individual that you want to kill. So it's in many cases a very good method to help manage the right wildlife. So it's two very different things. But canned hunting, you will find almost no supporters of canned hunting at least in the Western world, and we are the part of the world that sends the most traveling hunters to Africa.
Yes. And right on that topic, where you say the Western world sends the majority of hunters that come down here to Africa to hunt, I'd like to ask Dr. Matthew. It's estimated that the biggest percentage of all trophy hunters on the continent come from the United States of America. And it's only recent that I learned that there are trade expos, like the type of expos that we have in contemporary tourism, like WTM, Fitur in Spain, WTM Africa. I quite recently only found out that there are actually expos for the hunting community, and most of the trips that sell the most are trips down to Africa. And then on the other hand, you have the European Union, which from what I read is the world's second largest importer behind the United States when it comes to hunting trophies and African species. So the question I'd like to ask, and maybe also just something else that crosses my mind, is when you have politicians like Boris Johnson coming out and tweeting quite sternly that we should end this barbaric activity of hunting, and you have the British government now putting very strong restrictions on British citizens wanting to bring back trophies home after the hunt. I'd like to know, as HSI, what role, or rather how important is regulation and the government role and the role of politicians in your campaigns, in all these campaigns that you're running to put an end to hunting tourism, or trophy hunting as we call it?
Thanks. So these hunting fairs, these are big business, and you have fairs in the States, you have fairs in Europe, and just recently, I think it was the largest hunting fair in Germany was held in Dortmund. And it's interesting to hear Jens say that the Western world is very much against this canned hunting of particularly species like lions, when at that Dortmund fair there were several operators that were advertising these canned hunts in South Africa. And South Africa, as Jens said, it is infamous for its captive breeding operations to satisfy these hunters' desires. Antelope, as well as lions and buffalo, are selectively bred under intensive farming conditions that are encouraged. These animals are encouraged and bred to develop larger horns, and in the cases of lions specifically, the bigger mane. Hunter wants the big body, the big maned individuals. And in South Africa at the moment, you might be surprised to know that there are only about 3,000 wild or managed lions. However, there are 12,000 captive bred lions currently in South Africa. And these lions are being hunted in their hundreds by Western tourists that fly in to shoot a lion on a 3 or 4 day safari. So it is still happening in this country, and it is still being taken up by the Western world. So this issue that all hunters around the world are against it is just not true. When it comes to government, what we do know is that a well-governed and effectively managed protected area is a proven method for safeguarding wildlife habitats and biodiversity. These areas promote more ecological diversity than hunting areas, which often impact other species. For instance, predators on these hunting and breeding ranches, predators are often targeted for removal because they're competition. They might well be killing your prize, black impala or white impala or one of these rare breeds as such. Specifically when it comes to the UK and government action here, we have to really start listening more to what the people are saying. The government in the UK has listened, and they are considering a ban on the import of trophies from hunting around the world. Now, this is responsible governance, and too often governments and countries don't listen to their voters or the scientific evidence that's out there, and instead they act in the interest of the few, for profit, for those landowners that are selling these trophy hunt packages. In South Africa, last year we released a survey of the population, and it's a representative survey conducted by Ipsos. And what we've found is that since 2018, there's been an increase in opposition to trophy hunting from 56% in 2018 to 68% now. So the public, the people in South Africa, don't want trophy hunting. They don't want canned lion hunting. There's a similar level of opposition at 65% opposed to the canned lion hunting industry. Yet the government is still running these industries. This isn't just an issue that South Africa is speaking out about. This is also an issue that the whole world is speaking out against. The World Animal Protection NGO did a globally representative survey of adults coming from countries such as the US, the UK, Germany, and France. And these are the main countries that send tourists over to South Africa. They surveyed those adults, and they found that 71% of those adults felt that they would be put off from choosing a country as a holiday destination that has trophy hunting. So by having trophy hunting in our country, we are impacting that tourism industry, which, as I've already said, that's the main economic driver here. And you're damaging the GDP of your country by continuing these archaic practices, because tourists are slowly seeking more ethical and responsible tourism experiences. And I think South Africa and other African countries need to listen to that.
It's interesting comments, Dr. Matthew. Our time is really fast spent. But I know Jens wanted to respond. I'll give Jens an opportunity to respond to the future of trophy hunting, or what a world without hunting kind of looks like with all these restrictions that we now see. But before we touch on that, I'd like us to talk about the issue of funding conservation. And I feel like this could be the principal, or call it one of the biggest, influencers that are driving governments who continue to permit hunting in their protected areas. You have hunters who are bringing in huge sums of money, and this money governments are able to allocate to their wildlife authorities to carry out conservation efforts. Don't you feel like the absence, or rather the lack of enough funds or revenue to fund conservation, and quite unfortunately we don't have Uganda Wildlife Authority on the podcast, they would have told us that they would definitely use a few more shillings or a few more dollars in their campaigns to protect wildlife. Do you feel like this appetite by African governments to permit hunting could be largely driven by the lack of enough resources to fund conservation? And this is a question for both of you, so whoever feels confident to go first can take it on.
Thank you. I think that the African nations who are now considering to restart hunting tourism, because hunting tourism was a fact all over Africa like 50 years ago or more, but countries like Uganda, who are just getting started now, I think they are taking a very hard look, and I know there's people in Kenya doing the same, at the conservation success story of Southern Africa. Because Southern Africa is a conservation success story with no parallels in the world. Nowhere else in the world have the populations of wildlife grown as fast as they have in Southern Africa, with the possible exception of the United States and for some species, but not for entire ecosystems in Europe as well. And in all of these three places, a lot of the conservation is driven by the interest from hunters, from recreational hunters like me, who hunt because we like to and because we're willing to pay to get that experience. So I think they're getting inspired by the Southern African success. Just to put a few numbers in perspective, we can throw around all the numbers in the world, but in South Africa alone, there's an estimated 20 million large wild animals today. Out of those 20 million, at least 15 million are living on private areas managed with hunting. So it's 75% of all large wild mammals in South Africa are living in basically hunting areas that typically used to be farming areas. And just to very quickly go back to your question, what would happen if hunting goes away? Well, if hunting goes away, these farmers will not be able to just convert to phototourism because the phototourists are not there. Think of the millions and millions of people you would have to suddenly fly in. It's not going to happen. If it were going to happen, it would have happened decades ago because HSI and other animal welfare organizations would have shown us that this is indeed possible and not just talk. So if hunting goes away, the income from the wild animals goes away, and then they will just revert to farming. So they will bring in the Brahmins and the Boer goats, and they will start farming as they used to, and the wild animals will be gone. But that's not the worst. The worst is that the habitat will be gone. So it's not just the animals that are hunted, it's the entire ecosystems that are destroyed by intensive farming. And that will happen all over Africa, because in these remote areas where hunters are willing to go, phototourism is never going to be an alternative. Phototourists want to go to the prime areas like the Ngorongoro, where you have the huge concentration of animals and the scenic beauty of the landscape, close to the airports, a good road going in, lots of lodges in the area. Hunting areas can be far out where you have tsetse flies and disease, and the hunters are still willing to go there. And it pays off because hunters pay so much more per person than the photo tourism. So the ideal solution to me from a conservation perspective is to continue to combine the two, because obviously phototourism is great in the Ngorongoro or the Kruger Park or Etosha Park in Namibia. It works brilliant, and there's lots of private nature reserves as well where phototourism works. But in most of the hunting areas, phototourism is never, ever going to work. And this is why it works so well together. And still, it's a fact that you have more lions living in hunting areas than in non-hunting areas. It's just one species among others, but it's like that for almost every single species that is hunted.
Interesting comments. Now let's also hear from the side of HSI and Dr. Matthew in light of what the future would look like without trophy hunting. But also, as you respond to that, just help me also respond to my earlier question of whether this hunting appetite is stemming from the lack of enough conservation funds to drive conservation efforts on the continent.
When we look at the numbers of animals that have increased in South Africa, it's not really as simple as just to count the number of individuals. As I've already said, we have 12,000 lions living in captive scenarios. Is that a conservation success? No, it's simply not. Those animals are living appalling lives. And if you watch films like Blood Lions or Lions, Bones and Bullets, you'll see for yourself the conditions that these animals are being kept in. That's not conservation. And that's not just exclusively for lions. You have antelopes, you've got buffalo, you've got lots of other game species that are being intensively bred in countries like South Africa. And there may well be large numbers of them in very small enclosures that are kept in conditions that do impact them on welfare issues. Diseases increase in these areas. So can you consider all those conservation success stories? Just because you have more of them doesn't mean it's a conservation success. When we talk about the funding, photographic tourism or ecotourism is just one aspect. There are other alternatives that can be looked at. For instance, if you look at elephants, what is the cost for a live, or what benefit does it have to have an elephant alive? Elephants are worth approximately $1.6 million in ecotourism opportunities across their lifetime. That's 76 times more than they're worth dead. A single trophy hunting of an elephant might bring in $30,000 to $50,000 US. So there's alternatives there. If you look at the forest elephants in areas near Uganda, a recent paper by Chami et al. Found that the carbon value of a single forest elephant over its lifetime is $1.75 million. So the conservation value of preserving an elephant has multiple different impacts. You can do photographic tourism. It's going to be storing carbon for you in those forests. So the value there is almost beyond measure. So we need to keep these animals alive, and we need to look at alternative measures and alternative ways of generating that income. So communities could receive regular payments in the form of a carbon market, kind of like a carbon fund, for protecting those animals and offsetting the government's pollution and other aspects. So I think there are alternatives to fund conservation out there that don't have to come from trophy hunting. It's just how we as a people want to move forward with this. And I think the long-term look for trophy hunting is that this industry is on the way out. The people are speaking across the world, both in South Africa and in the other countries. And people are no longer happy with this industry continuing.
Yeah. Interesting comments, and I know Jens might not be so happy about all the campaigns against it. But this has been a really interesting, really fascinating discussion. I know Jens really has a burning response that he would like to have, but we need to draw to the end of the podcast, and I'll get your parting shots in a bit. And perhaps as you do that, Jens can respond to that final thing that he wanted to bring up. But for those tuned in, I feel like this point that we're on should be a fantastic point to end the episode on. It's been a long, but it's been a really fascinating discussion. I believe there's really no conservation model that you could say is 100% perfect. Those in support of hunting have their say, while those against it also have their say. And I'm not here to run a verdict. Mine is really to provide a platform to kickstart a discussion, have knowledge shared, have facts put out there. Mine is an opportunity for us to engage and have a conversation. So for you guys tuned in and listening, I'd like to know your thoughts as well. Head over to my Twitter handle, and there's currently a poll that is running. Please do leave your comment, or also leave your vote on whether you feel hunting is or isn't conservation. The handle is AHA Jonathan. That's AHA Jonathan. And with that said, I'd like to thank my guests for what has been a fantastic conversation. We've had, it's been one of my greatest pleasures to host both of you on the podcast today. But before I let you go, let's get your parting thoughts, and also let us know what is happening in your conservation worlds.
Very briefly, all these calculations, an elephant is worth 1.6 million during its lifetime. It's all very fine, but we have never ever seen it converted into practice. Right now, we are offering in South Africa 85 elephants from 3 different private areas for free to anybody who can supply them with safe and suitable habitat and make sure that they're not hunted. And there's no takers. We've been offering these elephants for 2 months now, including to the HSI, and we just hear silence because nobody wants elephants in Southern Africa because Southern Africa is saturated with elephants. There's no more room for elephants. There's no more habitat for elephants. And habitat is what we need. And then I find it a little bit peculiar to hear that each elephant is worth 1.6 million. So somebody could basically be a billionaire because there's thousands of elephants in Southern Africa right now that you can have for free if you supply the habitat. So if it's that easy, why are nobody doing it? That's a mystery, and I don't believe that it's ever going to happen. Unfortunately, I believe that the elephants that we're trying to give away right now will have to be culled later this year because there are simply too many for the area they live in, and there's no areas to take the elephants. So you could say I'm calling the bluff. If an elephant is worth 1.6 million, why does nobody want it for free?
That's thought. They call it what? Food for thought. Yes. Let's hear from Dr. Matthew as we wind up.
Yes. I think I've said pretty much everything here. That the writing is on the wall for the trophy hunting industry. In South Africa at the moment, the government is committed to ending the captive lion breeding industry. We're going to be actively working towards holding them to their commitments there. The government is committed now to considering welfare and well-being of wildlife when making policy decisions. So that means, the suffering of the individual animal must be considered. So the trophy hunting industry is on its way out. Countries around the world, as you've said, they're bringing in import and export bans on trophies. And places like South Africa, the public, it's firmly behind ending this industry. So I think the writing is on the wall, and it's only a matter of time now.
Okay, the writing is on the wall. Well, thank you, Jens. Thank you, Dr. Matthew, for joining the conversation today. I know with HSI, we had quite a bit of back and forth. We've had to reschedule this episode twice, but I'm really grateful that you did bear with me, and you've really provided a fascinating conversation, which I believe those tuned in have really, really, really enjoyed. So yes, guys, that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this fantastic episode as much as I did. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button, share this link in your circles, and let's get this conversation beyond this platform. For those that just can't get enough and would like to hear more of such conversations, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Listeners on Apple Podcasts can also leave a star rating on the podcast. The podcast is now available on all major streaming platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio in the US, TuneIn, Pandora, Castbox, Deezer, and several other platforms. As always, if you would like to have or maybe share a contribution or a comment or add to the conversation, feel free to send through those questions. My email is contact@jonathanbenaya, or you can also contact me at ahabenathan@pm.me. Both emails will be linked down below in the podcast notes. I also would like to say a very big thanks to our Patreons. Thanks for supporting the show. It's through your monthly pledges that we are able to keep this show alive. And with that said, I'd like to wish you some very fantastic and happy travels. Keep them responsible, and I will see you in the next one.